During the following program, look for web markers like this, which lead you to expanded coverage on our website. Tonight on Nova, hundreds die when a ferry goes down in a raging storm, but this man stayed alive.
I was driven by the fact that there was always one more form of life-saving device.
Centuries of tragedies at sea have led to better ways to escape because accidents happen. Experiments like these have led to innovations in life-saving equipment. But do they increase your chances of survival after you abandon ship? Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television.
And by iOmega, makers of personal storage solutions for your computer, so you can create more, share more, save more, and do more of whatever it is you do. iOmega, because it's your stuff.
This program is funded in part by Northwestern Mutual Life, which has been protecting families and businesses for generations. Have you heard from the quiet company? Northwestern Mutual Life.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
When a ship goes down in a storm, any survivors are at the mercy of an angry, unforgiving sea.
I saw the sea was about to engulf me. I was going to die in this black ferment, and it seemed to me such incredible waste. I was beginning to get so cold that you stop shivering. You don't even know about it. You get way beyond the shivering stage. You're just trying to ignore this and trying to preserve yourself amongst this complete carnage.
Within minutes of entering cold water, even the strongest swimmers struggle to stay alive. Cold saps their strength, and the risk of drowning increases dramatically. The harsh lessons of survival at sea have been learned from centuries of maritime accidents. Improvements in life-saving equipment have increased the chance of survival. But when disaster strikes, the sea remains a formidable foe. The events that unfolded on this ill-fated ship illustrate the acute problems of survival at sea. Like the Titanic and Lusitania before her, the car ferry Estonia was the pride of the fleet. Every day, she sailed across the Baltic Sea between Estonia and Sweden. It was a busy route, and the car deck, just above sea level, was often full. When she set off on September 27, 1994, there were almost 1,000 people on board. Most of them were asleep in their cabins as the sea began to get rough. A computerized reconstruction reveals what happened that night. It was not a particularly bad storm, but heavy seas battered the ship's bow door. The pounding put stress on the opening mechanism until the hinges snapped and the bow door hung loose. Shortly after 1 in the morning, it was forced open, and water began to pour into the car deck. Officers on the bridge noticed the water on a video monitor, but they did not realize the imminent danger. 15 minutes after the hinges snapped, the bow door fell off, releasing the ramp. The ship carried on at full speed for another minute. Water flooded the car deck, and the Estonia began to list. 8 minutes later, the crew put out a distress call.
Mayday, calling Mayday. Estonia, what's going on? Can you reply?
There were no emergency instructions from the bridge.
People were either stunned around me, they didn't move, they sat and didn't move, or they evacuated and ran into the ship. Now I knew that the middle of the ship, if there was any sort of degree of panic, would be the wrong place to go. And also I didn't know the way to lifeboats or anything like that. But it was obvious to me to work your way up the ship. If the ship was tilting that way, stay high. And yet people weren't coming out. I knew people were sleeping down there.
When the ship turned over on its side, hundreds were trapped in their cabins. Paul Barney clung to some pipes as the ceiling became a vertical wall.
Suddenly the moon came out from behind the clouds and lit up this pipework, which had been the pipework on the ceiling of the promenade deck. So it was like this dull moonlight, and I just said, right, there's only one thing to do, and climb that. So I climbed up that, and suddenly there I was on top of this enormous ship, on my own in my socks, and the massive gale and the waves breaking over the ship.
He found a small group of passengers desperately trying to board a life raft at the other end of the sinking hull.
I jumped in at the last moment as we hit the water, and immediately a wave turned the whole life raft upside down. So suddenly I was upside down in the life raft in the pitch black, and I had to swim out of the exit I came in up to the surface, where everyone was around sort of shouting and screaming and shouting. I was shouting for a life jacket, and it was just chaos complete. That's the moment of complete chaos for me, is when you're in the black in the water.
For the next few hours, Paul Barney clung to his life as others around him slipped into unconsciousness and drowned. As long as ships have sailed the seas, lives have been in peril. Centuries ago, in the days of wooden sailing ships, there were no lifeboats or lifebelts, so if a vessel foundered, the best way of staying afloat was to find some wooden wreckage. Sailing ships were often smashed on the rocks before shipwrecked sailors could be rescued. This infamous stretch of Yorkshire coastline had over 700 shipwrecks each winter in the middle of the last century. A new way of bringing stranded sailors safely ashore was needed.
The most significant development in the early part of the 19th century was the man-beam mortar. And this was the first successful attempt to make this vital connection between the stranded ship and the shore. This is an original mortar from about 1815, from the first 100 cast.
The idea was to fire a cannonball which carried a rescue line. The problem was making sure the line didn't snap. Sidney Alford, an explosives expert, follows the instructions of Captain Manby, the inventor. He ties in a length of leather to absorb the initial shock of the explosion.
It was essential that the line didn't foul as it was being fired to the ship, and so it was made up in these boxes, and then shortly before firing we will take the bottom frame off and the pins fall through the bottom of the box. Right, just put it there. Yep. And now, as we can see, the line is still in a tidy format, and when it's fired it just come out.
The mortar could shoot a lifeline several hundred yards out to sea. Once it was secured to the ship, the crew could be hauled to safety by volunteers on shore. This kind of rescue saved thousands of seamen's lives every year. Later, the mortar was replaced with a rocket, which had greater range and accuracy. The rocket-powered line was used well into this century. Each survivor was pulled to safety on a cork lifebelt attached to a pulley block called a breeches buoy. This equipment could only be used close to shore or from another ship. In the middle of the ocean, survival was a problem, particularly when ships were no longer made of wood. When iron hulls were introduced, passengers were concerned for their safety. If an iron ship sank, it went down quickly with little floating debris to cling to. To allay their fears, enterprising Victorian inventors came up with some curious survival aids. If the ship went down, a gentleman could always slip into his cabin trunk. This specially adapted model was lined with cork to provide extra buoyancy, ensuring a safe paddle home. In distress? Then why not mark the spot so rescuers can find you? A rubber suit, a paddle, and a life buoy? What more could a sinking passenger want? The Mayday mouthpiece. Ideal for projecting that urgent message to the loved one, if the gallant passenger can keep his head above the waves. Thankfully, none of these inventions was tested in an emergency. But the Victorians did come up with the first practical life preservers made of cork. They were worn by lifeboat crews during rescues. The cork life jacket would keep a man afloat, but testing one reveals its limitations. Dr. Frank Golden, a retired admiral and pioneer in maritime survival, assesses the jacket.
It gave added buoyancy, which helped the person to stay afloat in the water, but of course it has a number of faults which we know about today. The buoyancy is equally distributed around the body, around the front of the body and around the back of the body, so that if a person was unconscious and was lying face down in the water, he'd remain stable in that position. Secondly, there was no support for the head or neck. It's really just wrapped around the top of the body, leaving the shoulders and head out of the water. And that's fine for somebody who's conscious, who's alert, who's able to hold his head out. But the head actually is very heavy, specific gravity of the head. When a person loses consciousness, the neck muscles are failing, well then the head tends to flop forward and they could be found floating face down in the water, inhaling the water.
But any life jacket was better than nothing. When this World War I battleship turned over, the survivors who made it to the deck slid down the hull into the sea. Few wore life jackets, and some of them could not swim. If they were lucky, they might find a Carley float, which they could cling to. These light aluminum floats carried rations and first aid, but they were no use if a person's strength was fading. Thousands of seamen lost their lives in the cold waters of the Atlantic during the First and Second World Wars. Airmen were more fortunate. They were issued with Mae Wests. The early ones had to be inflated by blowing into a tube. They provided good buoyancy, but they suffered from the same problem as all early life jackets. If the airmen became unconscious, they were almost certain to drown.
Some of the problems of life jackets were identified in the Institute of Aviation Medicine in Farnborough during the war by two Air Force medical officers by the name of McIntosh and Pask.
Dr. Edgar Pask was the guinea pig in a series of experiments where he came as close as he dared to drowning.
Pask very heroically allowed himself to be anaesthetized. And he was anaesthetized and had a tube put into him to facilitate breathing while he was unconscious. He was then given a standard life jacket and immersed in the water. And it was quickly revealed that in an unconscious man, the head wasn't being kept clear of the water, or in fact in one case, I understand, he even sank. They showed that it was, if you were horizontal in the water, that was an undesirable position to be in, and they showed if you were vertical in the water, it was equally undesirable because the body tended to bob up and down periodically with the waves, and you got alternative wave covering the airway and not doing so. So they found out that the optimum position for a man wearing a life jacket in the water was at an angle of 45 degrees to the surface.
After these experiments, life jackets were redesigned with a firm collar to support the head. With a modern life jacket, it doesn't matter how a person enters the sea. On surfacing, the head will always be held upright and clear of the water.
So now I've got a nice splint for my neck, all the buoyancy in the front of my body, nice splint to my neck. When I'm floating now at 45 degrees, my head is going to be kept out of the water and my airway protected from calm water. But with rough water, when the waves are breaking, the waves will wash up over the front of the face and will wash over my airway. And I could drown quite easily when I lose consciousness. So to overcome that problem, you need some form of face screen. These splash guards will help protect the airway from the wave breaking up over the front of the life jacket. And if the person can get them on, it will enhance his ability of staying alive once he loses consciousness.
But even the most modern life jackets would not have saved the crew of this ship, which set sail on its maiden voyage in 1912. After disaster struck, hundreds of people plunged into the sea because there was not enough room on the lifeboats. The Titanic disaster alerted the world to the real danger of abandoning ship. The sinking of the unsinkable ship made nations sign international safety regulations for the first time. From then on, everyone traveling on a ship was guaranteed a place on a lifeboat and an approved life jacket. All ships were required to conduct lifeboat drills. This was a simple procedure for an upright ship in calm water, but in more extreme conditions, it could deteriorate into chaos. "22 years after the Titanic, in 1934, the Morro Castle set sail from New York to Cuba, which was a popular cruise destination at the time. It had a full complement of lifeboats, but the passengers were not taught how to use them. The captain wanted everyone to enjoy the party atmosphere. On the return journey, a small fire on the lower decks was allowed to get out of control. As the Morro Castle approached New York, the order was given to abandon ship. The crew had no idea how to organize an evacuation. The plight of the passengers inspired a dramatization of the disaster. One of the passengers, Dolly McTeague, was on her honeymoon with her husband, Sidney.
When we went out of the cabin and down the hall, we then went to see if we could get into one of the lifeboats. And nobody was, the lifeboats were gone. Crew was going into the lifeboats, and there we were, the passengers, all screaming and yelling, "Where are the lifeboats?" We thought there'd be more lifeboats that we can get into. So the panic was just crazy, because what we were going to do next, and no one was around to tell us what to do. And that's when somebody said, let's jump overboard. So this one jumped overboard, that one jumped overboard. And I was pushed up against the railing. I couldn't move, and my hands are waving. And before I knew it, somebody picked up my legs and threw me in.
Many of the lifeboats were burned in the fire. The rest were commandeered by the crew, who left the passengers to fend for themselves.
We tried reaching for a boat, and they wouldn't let us on. They passed us right by, and they said, no, 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 no. So I was ready to give up. And so they said, no, you can't give up, you won't give up. And I'm looking down at this lovely girl with the lovely black hair, and she was all burnt. Her face was crisp. And I said, darn it, I'm not going to die. I won't give up. I refuse to give up. So there was a boat way over there, and we happened to have enough strength in us to swim over to that boat. But we were saved, at least on the boat.
The 4 lifeboats that made it to the shore carried 119 crew members and only 15 passengers. The code of the sea had been abandoned with the sinking ship.
And we always thought that the crew was, you come first. But we were so mad and determined to find out what the heck happened on that boat, because something was wrong. Something had to be wrong.
The Morro Castle tragedy cost the lives of 124 people. After an inquiry, the captain was prosecuted for negligence. The disaster highlighted a number of problems. The firefighting provisions were completely inadequate, with hydrants locked and hoses stowed away. The passengers had been given no safety drills, and most important was the complete failure of the crew to deal with the emergency. On this training ship, merchant marine cadets learn to prevent such disasters. If there's a fire on board, a well-rehearsed emergency plan swings into action. The sailors become firefighters and divide up into small teams to locate the source. They learn how to use breathing apparatus to navigate through smoke. If they can extinguish the fire quickly, it will avoid the need to pump large volumes of water which could flood the ship. They are also trained to search through the ship's compartments for victims overcome by smoke. If a fire should take hold, the worst-case disaster scenario is to abandon ship.
On Patriot State, what's one of the most important things that we've always taught you? Order and discipline. Without the order and discipline, we have people jumping over the side. If we had people jump over the side, they'd be jumping on top of one another, injuring each other in the water. Order and discipline is the key.
The only way of abandoning ship without major loss of life is to ensure everyone knows the drill.
Sound the abandoned ship signal.
Abandoned ship, abandoned ship.
Stand by engine. Stand by engine aye.
Down in the engine room, the crew is particularly vulnerable. Automatic doors seal the ship into fireproof, watertight compartments. If there's a fire on a lower deck, sailors can be trapped. So many ships have an escape tunnel that runs along the entire length of the propeller shaft. A vertical chimney is their direct link to the top deck.
Abandoned ship, abandoned ship, abandoned ship.
Mahoney, yeah. DePriest, Malaikas.
Not knowing where to go is a common problem. On a well-organized ship, everyone reports to a muster station, where a roll call is carried out to ensure no one is missing.
On my count of 3, release your tricing pennant. 1, 2, 3.
Some of these cadets will become the cruise ship officers of the future. One day they may have to rescue passengers who are frightened and untrained in the ways of the sea.
Coxswain, till it towards the hull.
we get out.
But there are even more extreme situations. Escape from warships under enemy fire has its own set of rules. For as well as saving lives, the crew must do everything possible to save the ship. One of the most heroic examples of this was on board the aircraft carrier USS Franklin. It was bombed by kamikaze pilots in the Second World War. The ship's own bombs and ammunition started to explode, triggering massive fires. Most of the crew was evacuated, but damage control teams stayed on, battling the fire for 5 days as the ship limped back across the Pacific. Today, in Portsmouth, England, a simulator called The Hazard enables sailors to practice damage control without leaving the dock. Working in a small compartment as the water level rises, they experience firsthand the terror of trying to prevent a flooding ship from sinking. The hull is riddled with holes. Their task is to stem each new leak. This high-tech simulator mimics the motion of a ship taking on water. High-pressure water jets are triggered inside to simulate direct hits beneath the waterline. It's like a plumber's worst nightmare. To combat the danger, the crew adopts a low-tech approach. They use crude tools, wedges of wood, hammers, and scaffolding braces. Wood expands when it's wet, so by plugging each hole, the sailors can cut down the water flow. They must work fast, because the water level in the compartment is almost up to their necks. As the interior continues to flood, the rocking of the simulator starts to slow down, just as it would on a real ship that's taking on water. What determines the moment a ship sinks is an exact science. A ship is most stable when it's able to right itself quickly. Paradoxically, the quicker it rolls, the more stable it is. This scale model of a destroyer enables naval engineers to see what happens when different sections of the ship are flooded.
As flood water enters the ship, it becomes progressively less stable by opening up that machinery space there, allowing the water to flood in, and then healing the model again. You can see that its rate of recovery has gotten slower. As more flood water enters the ship and spreads throughout the length of the vessel, we get to a point where the ship starts to heel over, and eventually we get to a point where the captain has got to make a decision as to when he's going to give the order to abandon ship because the vessel is beyond salvation.
When that point is reached, disaster strikes quickly. The Estonia sank at 1:40 in the morning, with most of the 980 passengers still trapped below decks. There was not enough time to fill the lifeboats. Only 137 people would survive the night. Paul Barney was fighting for his life in his upturned raft.
The night sort of really closed into some really horrendous weather, and I was getting the bad shock, and you can't really function properly under shock. You're getting colder and colder and colder, and every time a wave came over the raft, you got soaked to the skin, and you just felt your body heat dissipate out. You start to feel incredibly tired under hypothermia, and there's this incredible desire just to put your head down on the side of the life raft and fall asleep. I mean, that's the desire and the strength of that is so strong. But I knew from past experiences that would be instant. Unconsciousness would be instant death, really, because you'd either slip into the life raft and drown or overboard.
Hypothermia is one of the biggest problems of survival at sea, but its scientific investigation has a tragic history, which began in the Second World War. The German Luftwaffe was concerned by the number of pilots lost at sea. Sometimes they died of cold even after they were rescued. It was this problem which led to a series of horrific experiments at the Dachau concentration camp. Nazi doctors watched as their subjects slowly shivered to death. The perpetrators of these unethical trials were later convicted of war crimes. One of the few survivors was a Dutch prisoner called Post Uitweer, who was 25 when he was ordered to strip and enter the freezing water.
So we were completely naked in the water, and I don't know how long I stayed in the water. Could be half an hour, could be more, but I was terrible cold. My muscles were frozen. I hardly could move, and I couldn't speak. I could hardly speak anything. And then at a certain moment, I was heaved out of the bath and put into a hot bath.
Few of these Nazi experiments had any scientific value, but they established that hot water was the best way of treating hypothermia. They also found that human beings lose consciousness when the body temperature falls below 28 degrees. What to do with this information became highly controversial, because at least 80 prisoners are thought to have died in these brutal experiments. Cold water survival research since the war uses volunteers. Royal Navy researchers filmed a series of demonstrations with British Olympic swimmers.
We now know that it's not just even hypothermia alone is the problem. We now know that in the first few minutes of immersion, you suffer a phenomenon called cold shock, where you can't control your breathing, and your heart rate soars, and your blood pressure goes up, and you're totally incapacitated for just a few minutes if you're not used to cold water. And even competent swimmers, Olympic standard swimmers, get into difficulty in those first few minutes, and they can't even swim a short distance to save their own lives. Later on, and much later, body temperature ebbs away, and then people suffer from hypothermia. So they have to survive the cold shock phenomena before they even die from hypothermia.
Another volunteer was submerged in water at 5 degrees centigrade. The experiment was supposed to last 5 minutes, but he could only withstand 2.5. Paul Barney felt the onset of hypothermia start to jeopardize his ability to survive.
You can't really think or function properly. I was trying to find a life jacket. I'd found one, but I couldn't actually do it up properly. And it was very hard to function with the cold hands and think clearly with the shock. So my main intent was to try and get rid of the shock through deep, slow breathing, sort of yogic breathing, to try and reduce my heart rate. I knew that high adrenaline was no use to me there, because it was just burning up all my energy.
Even the most simple actions become impossible in cold water.
We thought it would be a good idea to test the effects of superficial body cooling on some simple survival actions like opening a flare. And all the muscles controlling one's hands are very superficial in the body. So these muscles cool very early, and that makes the man's hands relatively useless. It's fine for people in centrally heated offices who may design these things, but for the poor survivor with cold, numb, clumsy, sick fingers, that can take an awful long time and can be very difficult to achieve.
Staying alive after abandoning ship is hard enough. But an even more extreme survival challenge is underwater escape from a submarine. Being entombed beneath the water with a limited supply of air has always been the submarine crew's greatest fear.
Keep the watch, last man down from the bridge, hatch secured, bridge rigged for dive. Last man down, hatch secured, bridge rigged for dive, aye, sir.
The first recorded rescue or escape from a submarine was probably 1851, when a Bavarian artillery sergeant named Wilhelm Bauer, who was also a submarine inventor, developed a boat which was very effective for its time, which got stuck in the bottom of Kiel Harbor.
This German movie dramatizes Bauer's pedal-powered descent into the harbor. Everything went well, until water started to leak through the hull. It rapidly sank 60 feet to the bottom.
He had two assistants with him. They immediately panicked. He calmed them down, flooded the submarine intentionally to build up the pressure in the submarine to the same as the water outside. Once it filled with water, he then opened the hatch and the three of them swam to the surface.
But escape by flooding the entire vessel became impractical as submarines got larger, with more crew members to evacuate. So the Navy experimented with an airlock chamber that was flooded for each individual's escape. The men were equipped with breathing apparatus for the ascent. An inflatable bag was filled with oxygen from a small cylinder, allowing them to escape from depths of up to 200 feet. In 1939, an accident aboard the USS Squalus caused the submarine to sink 240 feet to the ocean floor. An open valve had allowed the engine room to flood. To save the submarine, the crew sealed off the area, sacrificing 26 men on the other side. The survivors feared they were too deep to risk escaping with a breathing apparatus. Their only other hope was to wait to be rescued. Along the East Coast, an emergency operation was set in motion. A ship carrying a new, untested McCann rescue chamber raced to the scene. The submarine crew realized it was going to take at least 24 hours to arrive. Carl Bryson and Danny Persico were both young sailors in their 20s.
One of the problems was to stay alive, okay? And the air was bad, and we had very little oxygen to release, and we released all the oxygen. We put out all the soda lime that we had to absorb the CO2, and the air was getting progressively worse in the boat. And so the main thing to do was to conserve oxygen.
A diver was lowered to attach guide wires so the rescue chamber could descend to the escape hatch.
I could hear the diver feet with his big metal shoes when they hit the deck, and it was very clear, and I could hear his conversation into his phone in the helmet, and he was very clear in the language he was using with his really cussing and everything, problems he was having attaching the cables.
With the chamber locked to the submarine, the rescue could begin.
The crewmen could open the hatch within the chamber, the hatch to the submarine, and then pass from the submarine into the steel chamber, close their hatch again, close the bottom hatch of the McCann chamber, and then be pulled up a cable which ran through the center of the chamber up to the surface. And it could go up and down several times like this, just like a lift.
Danny and Carl were in the last group to be rescued. After 34 hours on the bottom, they waited for the bell to return for the final trip.
It felt good till we got up to about 155-foot level, and we couldn't go up, and we couldn't go down.
The lifting cables had become entangled, so the men were trapped in the bell halfway between the submarine and the ship. The only way of saving them was to haul the bell up by hand.
The best ride I had in my life was in that bell, even though it took 4.5 hours to make it.
The McCann rescue chamber was never used in an emergency again. It was eventually replaced by an underwater rescue vehicle that could reach the greater depth of nuclear submarines. This mini-rescue sub rides piggyback on a mother sub. In an emergency, it travels to a disabled submarine, locks onto an escape hatch, and then ferries survivors from the stricken sub back to the mother sub.
105 feet.
So far, it's never been used in an emergency. When accidents occur at shallow depths, there's a much easier way of escape. In this water tank, British submarine crews learned the buoyant ascent method of escape. They wear a special suit filled with air. After taking a few last breaths of compressed air, they zip up the suit and climb into a flooded escape chamber. The buoyancy of the suit guarantees a rapid ascent.
When the hatch opens, he goes. The hatch is the only thing that's holding him down. With that much buoyancy, he goes straight like that. And whether he likes it or not, he goes up to surface. He can sing a song if he feels inclined. He's got a hat full of air around his face. So why hold your breath? And he can look out of his window and see the water getting lighter. I personally used to put my hands like that and go around in a spiral, and you can then see what's in the sea above you, because it's not very nice coming up under a boat.
In a real escape, the survivor could face a long wait in the sea. To protect him from hypothermia, the suit is heavily insulated and also has an inflatable life raft. It keeps him out of the water, cocooned from the cold. Life rafts are critical to prevent the rapid drop in body temperature common to all sea survivors. At the Marine Training Center in Holland, oil workers and ship crews are trained how to use life rafts. These men are wearing insulated suits, which increase survival times in cold water. But clambering into a life raft, even when it's calm, can be difficult. Most ships carry self-inflating life rafts, which can be deployed quickly. But as Paul Barney discovered, they sometimes get turned upside down by wind or waves.
In the English press, there was talk of the fact that we should have righted the life raft after we'd got on it. But in those conditions, it seemed completely ridiculous suggestion, because it was absolutely impossible to do that with 16 or 20 civilians in a force 9 gale with a 40-foot swell next to a sinking ship. I mean, there was no way anyone was going to... People weren't even communicating amongst themselves, let alone one person trying to get everybody off.
To overcome these problems, this ship was designed with a new way of evacuating people. The Stena Explorer is a high-speed car ferry. Although it can carry up to 1,500 passengers, this giant catamaran has no lifeboats. In the event of an accident, the crew deploys enormous inflatable escape chutes. They are taking part in an evacuation test monitored by Britain's Marine Safety Agency. 200 crew members must demonstrate they can evacuate the entire ship in under 18 minutes. They slide down two 80-foot escape chutes to a floating platform, which is linked to 3 enormous life rafts. Each has a capacity of 135 people. It's a daring concept to evacuate everyone from the ship without getting their feet wet. But it remains to be seen how untrained passengers would cope with the slides in 50-knot gales.
Okay, well done everybody. We're just going to do a quick count-up and then we'll be disembarking in around 5.
Or how these whale-like rafts would perform in a storm. One of the toughest places to escape from is an oil rig at sea. The risk of fire and the great height of the platforms make evacuation particularly difficult. A solution to this problem came from a Dutch company called Verhoeven. Back in the 50s, Just Verhoeven started a small company which would eventually produce a new form of lifeboat.
Now, my father himself was a master craftsman, and at that time, and then I'm talking about early 50s, he found the skill to make aluminium lifeboats, which were never made before at that time.
Aluminum had many advantages. It was strong, lightweight, and fireproof. But Verhoeven realized that to improve lifeboats, the launching system needed to be redesigned.
Now, using a cradle like this, you can see that a lifeboat can now be launched within a few seconds. Now, with this model from 1960, my father met 2 of his goals. First goal was to get away from the ship as quick as possible. Second was to leave safely as possible. But the third goal couldn't be met at that time. He wanted to have a lifeboat being self-righting under all circumstances.
This goal would take longer to achieve. Verhoeven went ahead and built a full-scale prototype. It was tested on the canal next to the factory. A rich ship owner who had lost 2 ships in heavy seas funded the project because he wanted safer lifeboats for his ships. Over the next 25 years, Verhoeven perfected the design. If his lifeboat was to be used from oil platforms, he had to ensure that it could be launched from a great height. He developed a pointed bow to reduce the impact on passengers as the boat hit the water. By shifting the center of gravity and making the superstructure more buoyant, he achieved his final goal.
Now, although this lifeboat may look like a toy, it meant to us a great deal, because I will show you that this lifeboat could not only launch from big heights, but it's also self-righting under all circumstances.
To demonstrate the extraordinary resilience of his lifeboat, Verhoeven began rough sea trials on a scale model. Despite the success of his trials, he could find no buyers. He showed the boat could survive the biggest waves, was completely watertight, and could even withstand fire.
When this freefall lifeboat is launched, there is always a possibility that the platform is in a sea fire. Now, in order to avoid that this boat is being burned, it is equipped with a water spray system on the outside.
In 1984, Verhoeven tested the boat to see how it might fare in a burning sea. 5,000 liters of kerosene were ignited. With the water spray system triggered, the boat was engulfed in flames for 10 minutes.
The result of the test was brilliant. We kept track of the temperature inside, and we were very pleased to see that it was only 30 degrees Celsius, which is equal to 85 Fahrenheit, so just like a sunny day.
The importance of this feature became clear in 1988 when the Piper Alpha oil platform exploded in the North Sea. A huge fireball engulfed the rig, making it impossible to launch conventional lifeboats. Many oil workers died jumping into the burning sea. As a result of this disaster, the oil industry began to invest in a better solution.
From that moment, from the moment of the Piper Alpha disaster, people were motivated to pay a little bit more money for safety in general. And that was the key of the success of our free-fall lifeboats.
Free-fall lifeboats have now been installed in many oil platforms and tankers. Anyone who might have to use them is required to participate in test drills.
Everybody get in position. On the assistant coxswain to open the life support system.
All passengers must be well strapped in for the big drop. The free-fall lifeboat provides a rapid escape from danger for trained crews, but it is not suitable for mass evacuation. It would have been hard to deploy on a ship listing as fast as the Estonia. Paul Barney's ordeal continued until first light, when helicopters began rescuing survivors. 10 people on his life raft did not make it through the night.
By dawn, there was about 7 people left in the life raft. I was driven by the fact that there was always one more form of life-saving device or something that could save my life. For me, I was stuck in this little deflating life raft for 5 hours, expecting it to go, and I knew the next form of life-saving equipment would be the life jacket. And if that went, then I was going to have to look for something else. But I was always constantly looking on the horizon and always trying to gain information as to what could possibly be the next thing that was going to save my life. I was ushering people off myself, saying, look, it's all right, I can hang on. I didn't actually know that. I don't remember that. I didn't know I was the last one off the life raft at all until I saw it on film later on.
He had survived the Baltic Sea through his sheer determination to live. The horror of this tragedy prompted international action. Today, ferries must provide automatic evacuation systems and life rafts that cannot be flipped in a storm. The sea will always be an unforgiving environment. But the lessons from past disasters hold the key to our survival.
What do you need to know when accidents happen? Be prepared. Log on to NOVA's website. The Escape Set is available on home video cassette for $49.95 plus shipping and handling. To order, call 1-800-255-9424. Nova is a production of WGBH Boston. Major funding for Nova is provided by the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television.
This program is funded in part by Northwestern Mutual Life, which has been protecting families and businesses for generations. Have you heard from the quiet company? Northwestern Mutual Life.
And by iOmega, makers of the 1 and 2 gig jazz drive, which lets you save worlds of imagination and give birth to prehistoric creatures, all in a 4-inch square. iOmega, because it's your stuff.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
This is PBS.
We are quality. We're committed to providing the best in all we do, and it shows.
That's why world-class filmmakers and performers come to us.
They won't settle for less, and neither will we. Who are we?